Well, hello, good afternoon, everybody. So you have a choice for this afternoon session. You can either put on the headphones, but we're also going to keep the speakers running for this session because this is our, if you like, our main event for today, and we have the IMPA SAVE Council and guests for the afternoon session around the hugely important IMEF initiative. So if you don't want the background noise, you can put the headphones on. If you're happy with that, then that's fine. Before I hand over to Mikael Carlson, the chairman of the IMPA SAVE initiative, I just got a couple of thank yous to make, if I can, a repeat of this morning. Our sponsors, essentially, to all of our sponsors, in particularly to our title sponsor, which is Galliap. As I mentioned this morning and explained a bit about them, Galliap are launching their service here at IMPA London this year, and you know, I'd encourage you. Few people have asked me, where are the Galliap guys? Well, they are here, I think, now. So, come and let me know, and I can point you in the right direction there. Very exciting initiative. So I'm going to hand over, if I can pass this to you, Mikael, and you're going to take the center stage.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you for showing up today. I have a very good panel here, which I'm going to introduce in a second. But before I'm going to do that, I'd like to set the stage and why we're here and how we even got here. About 5 years ago, we discovered that we were bringing plastic aboard our ships, which initially started the IMPA SAVE initiative. Rasmus, who sits here, challenged me on the data. Do you even know that's a good thing to produce water on board a ship? I didn't. I just knew it was a good idea. The next thing I knew is we got the data, and Rasmus presented this 2 or 3 years ago here in London, and we found out that to clean the water on board our ships, to produce drinking water for the crew on board, the emissions producing machine equaled the production of 354 plastic bottles, half liters PET. And that's no lie. This is the correct information. And then I tell you that you are bringing probably 15,000 liters on board your ships. And if you bring them in half-liter bottles, that's 30,000 bottles. So you can just do the math, how much emissions that is. And that really offset what we're about to talk about today, the actual emissions on the products we procure. But before we get into that, I'd like to bring a little bit further, because one of the challenges talking about emissions and emissions we get in the air, the CO2, is we can't see it. We know it's there, but we can't see it. Then we can feel it on the global warming and the heat waves of the rain, the hurricanes, the typhoons we see. I spoke to Alice Drew today, coming from Hong Kong. He had a typhoon chasing him, but he got out of Dodge. But it's more and more and more. And I think the problem we're struggling with is, since we can't see the problem, it's harder for us to grasp. It's hard for us to do things about it. And then all of a sudden, we got rules and regulations coming in effect telling now you got to measure everything you do. And that leaves a whole different problem. Because there's a lot of data points that now has to connect, which is something we understand, and as to why we're here today. And as to why we formed the IMEF. So we don't have A, B, and C doing their own calculations on the emissions, because as a ship chandler or as a service provider to the ship owners, you get lost in translation along the way, and there's no way you can cope with it. So I'm going to stop talking and hand over to Rasmus here. He's going to walk you a little bit through what the IMEF initiative is and where we're heading.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Michael. Wow. Somebody gave me a microphone, so watch out. Yeah, my name is Rasmus, and thank you, Michael, for the quick introduction into the IMEF. So what is IMEF? It's IMPA Maritime Environmental Footprint. It's all about adding environmental data to the product that some of you sell and some of you buy. Now, why is it important that we start adding environmental data to what we sell and what we buy? Now, if we rewind a little bit back, the European Union introduced an initiative called Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive some years back. Now, suddenly, the European Union will need corporations to start reporting the climate footprint of what they do. Not necessarily only from fuels as we're used to in the maritime industry, but also indirect emissions from the supply chain. Why is that relevant for the maritime industry? Well, of course, this will pertain to the industries that needs to report under this directive. And we will talk a little bit about other initiatives by EU trying to scale back on this initiative. Some of you might have heard of Omnibus, some of the initiatives saying, okay, let's simplify a little bit to make the European Union more competitive. But we'll touch base on that. So back to the IMEF. It's all about reporting emissions on what you buy and what you sell. Now, if we look at a vessel from the top-down perspective, so when we analyze the emissions of a ship, you have, of course, the fuel. For some vessels, the fuel is 80–90% of the total emissions. But what about the remaining 10%? How is that distributed? Well, then you have some percentage contributing from the construction of the vessel and some from the maintenance and a little bit on the end of life. Now, when we had looked at the analysis of once you start decarbonizing the fuel, as we are well on the way doing, we will see the emissions from the vessel's fuel drop. And then we will see the remaining emissions will start increase in importance, meaning the construction, maintenance, operations, end of life will now increase substantially in importance. And why is that? Well, it's simply because that we're not touching base on all the other things, but we're lowering the emissions. So the overall emissions are dropping, but now procurement probably goes from 3% to 15% of the emissions of a ship. That's big numbers. And that is the future we are heading into. And that is very interesting for ship owners around the world because many of them, especially the larger ones, have committed to net zero emissions. What does that mean? Well, it means that they have committed to not polluting or emitting emissions, bottom line. Well, you can ask yourself, well, the ship will always emit emissions from when you build it and everything you do on the vessel. Yes, but at the end, the ship owner have obligated themselves to offset the emissions by other activities that will cancel it out. Well, is that really, how does that work? Well, it basically works that the ship owner have to do everything they can, possibly with fuel and everything else, to lower the emission of the vessel. And as soon as they realize they cannot do any more, they have to buy premium offsets from third parties that have guaranteed that something else is happening to offset these remaining emissions. And that's a premium that the ship owner will need to pay for. So a smart ship owner will start saying, okay, if I now have to pay at the end quite a lot to get rid of the last emissions, I'll probably need to start early to realize how can I minimize my emissions as soon as possible, because at the end I'll have to pay extra money to get rid of them. So the IMEF initiative is an initiative that will accommodate the increased reporting demand from the ship owner. Now we talk about the directive from the European Union, but also the voluntary actions by many ship owners toward net zero. And they will be able to do that because the IMEF will make it possible and create the guidelines for calculating the emissions of the products that you sell and you buy. And also we have put in place a digital standard on how you share the data. So even though the data is not ready, and that will be some of the discussions we're going to have a little bit later, how do we do this? Because there is tons of suppliers out there that are not ready. But we have a few ship owners who is ready and we have a few suppliers. But that's the whole idea, saying if we create the framework on how to do it and how to share the data, then we need to work together, all of us here, on how do we actually take it to the next level. But we have created in the IMEF a basis, a starting ground with how to do it and how we transmit the data and how you receive the data. And what's left now is to figure out how do we take it to the next stage. So that was the fly-in, Michael. Thank you.
So what are we talking about here today? It's actually everything we do. The fact you're sitting here, you got here somehow by a bike, by a bus, probably not by train, maybe even walked, but you got to London somehow. And that leaves a trail of emissions. That's just us as human beings. And I think often when we are talking about emissions, it's something we do at work. IMF is something we do at work, but we never think about it's something we do in our daily lives. It's our behavior. At home, at work. So when we talk about emissions, and we're talking about measuring these emissions, why is this so hard?
Yeah, it is hard because in maritime, of course, we are dealing with a very, very, very large number. Can you hear it? Yeah. Can you hear me all well? Okay, good. We're dealing with a unique, large data set of items. So it's look like very, very challenging. And this is the reason why with this framework, we're trying to be mindful of how we will be able to calculate everything from day one. There are, when we take in the suppliers community, the majority of the suppliers in the maritime business are resellers. There's few manufacturers, but the majority is resellers. It's people which is buying products from one source and they are reselling it. So the ability for these suppliers to calculate the emissions using the activity basis methodology is very limited. So the manufacturers, by applying the standards, they would be able quite easily to measure the emissions of a product from the sourcing of the material, the energy which is needed, the manufacturing process, and then the delivery. All the resellers are basically looking at us and say, how can we measure? The shortcut for the first phase will be to use the spend basis or the weight basis methodologies, which are described in the standard that will be circulated, which will allow the systems to automatically calculate the emission of a certain product on the basis of an average, on the basis of the product's description and the categorization of this product. So it seems difficult, but at the beginning it will be quite easy anyway to get some form of calculation by using these two methodologies. In the working group that we have been putting together, we have brought a representative from all the various steps into the procurement process. So we have suppliers, manufacturers, the procurement platforms that are present here, the procurement softwares, the ERPs, which are used by the buyers to process the transactions, and the buyers, some ship owners in representation, to make sure that we look at each and every step and we are able to find a simple way for the suppliers involved into this process to collect and or calculate this information and pass it on. So in the end, it's not that difficult. The difficulties will be ramping up and moving from a very low percentage of activity basis information, which are actually based on the real emission generated by the process, so to replace what we are going to calculate in the initial phase as average using the spend basis and the weight basis methodology.
Yeah, and I thank you, Paolo. I think also you introduce some new terms here: spend-based, weight-based, and activity-based. And I think let me just try and take us back and just quickly get everybody up to speed. So when we talk about emissions and calculating emissions of products, there are different ways we can calculate emissions. What many ship owners are doing today is that they're using what's called spend-based setup. So they're multiplying their financial spend, typically in dollars or euro, times a emission factor that they have from databases, and then they deduct an inflation ratio over that period that they're calculating. So that will mean that if you buy $1, you multiply in this case by 2, you have 2 kilos of CO2 of something you buy. Now, naturally, using the spend-based only allows for 2 variables, right? So either you spend less or you find another emission factor. So if you buy something that's more expensive, lasts longer, will have to be repaired less or have some better materials, you have to pay more for that typically. It will have a higher environmental impact. Does that make sense? So you're getting penalized by having something that lasts longer and doesn't break down as often. So that naturally will have to change, and that's also why we have different ways that are introduced, not by us, but by the environmental community. So the other one is weight-based averages. So basically, you have the weight of a product, and then you have average calculations from database sets. So here you're able to say chicken thigh with skin per kilo will be in this range. And then you know every time I buy a kilo of chicken thigh, in this case, will have this environmental footprint. Now you're away from the cost of the product. That's better, right? Now, where we want to go with the IMEF initiative is the next step even further. And that is getting the data directly from the manufacturer of the, in this case, chicken thigh or another product. Meaning that if they're using renewable energy, they're using recycled materials in the production of their products, this will be counted in. So suddenly you have the possibility as a procurement professional to count what others are doing to make the world a better place into the products you buy. So now you go away from just price, quality, delivery time. Now you introduce another factor called the environmental footprint. And that's the whole idea with the IMEF. It is, let's figure out how we do this. But just to summarize, these are the 3 different ways on how to calculate emissions. And naturally, you could say where we want to go is the last option, where we get the real data in. And back to your question, Michael, why is it so difficult? And I think, as you also said, Paolo, it requires the suppliers to actually contribute with data. They need to put in software or a calculation method. How much energy did we use to produce this? How much steel did we use? How much rubber from the O-rings, and so on and so on. Suppliers are not ready, not all suppliers, and it will also be an investment for some suppliers. But other suppliers are more mature because they can see it as a strategic advantage. And what we came out with 2 years ago in Hamburg was really saying, okay, let's say there are suppliers out there, there are ship owners out there ready to receive the data. How would the supplier know how to calculate and how to share the data? And I think that's the core of the IMEF initiative.
Thank you, Rasmus. Dorte, you work for a large ship owner in Denmark. How do you work with suppliers today?
Well, since we started this initiative, and we don't know if it was 2 years ago or 4 years ago, we have brought it up in all the supplier meetings, all of us. I have Klaas here with me today on the provision side, and he can vouch that we do not have a supplier meeting without this coming up. For now, it's difficult, Michael. I mean, we don't know what we are talking about. We have some suppliers that are extremely advanced, like Viking, and then we have other suppliers who needs to be guided, and we need to be guided as well. But that doesn't mean that I don't think we have come a long way in the past years. I think we have. And for now, we are not taking it into consideration whether we can get the numbers or not, but we are taking into consideration whether people are willing to work with us and follow along on our journey in this. So it's super important, Michael, and we will continue. But I also highly recommend everybody to sign up for IMEF, because we are on a road together, and rather being on the road together than being left behind. We can see that from the amount of work that has happened the past 2, 3, 4 years.
Thank you, Dorte. Scorpio, what are you doing?
Similarly to Dorte company, we have been discussing about this with suppliers. We recently launched the tender, and for the first time, we added a column along with the price, also with the emissions. And we ask our suppliers, without making this qualification term for the tender, to provide us the emission information, the product carbon footprint information for each of the item where they had the information available. This has triggered that some of the suppliers went to their manufacturers asking for the information if it was available. And there were mixed feedback. Obviously, there are some sub-suppliers, some manufacturers which are ready, some others which are not. Definitely, we can see in our day-to-day life that this information is coming available. There are more and more companies which are calculating product carbon footprint and or emission in general. The majority of you has taken a flight to come here. If you take your electronic tickets, the emission you generated on your flight to come here is there, has been calculated, is an average. Are they taking in consideration your weight and how many luggage you brought with you? Probably not. Is an average. It's the same number for all the passengers on the ship, but it's an information which is there. The industry is calculating. There is more and more items you buy in the supermarket in your day-to-day life which has the emissions. So there is no reason to believe that tomorrow the supplier of paintbrushes, the manufacturer of screwdrivers will not have this information available and will be able to pass it on. So what we're doing, we're trying to talk and explain to suppliers that they need to modify their purchasing contracts with their sub-suppliers and manufacturer, show interest and make it clear to the sub-suppliers that this information has to flow in if available. If it's not there, we don't need somebody to calculate it for ourselves. We don't want information which is calculated in a non-traceable and non-verified way, but talking through the supply chain about the need to have this information is what we're doing. And many of you had a conversation with us in the recent past and know that this is something which is important. With this initiative, we're trying to make sure that also other ship owners and other ship suppliers see the same need and start talking and collecting the product carbon footprint information.
Thank you, Paolo. One thing that comes to mind, and please, if you got questions, just raise your hands, and you'll be an open question here if you got questions to us. Rasmus, this is more to you. We see all these regulatory initiatives coming in from EU, and now there are rumors that they might even scale that back. We hear about the omnibus, and then you're also sitting as in the EU guideline, helping these guys out. Is this even going to be relevant?
Yes. What we are seeing today from the European Union is an effort to make the European countries more competitive. Because once they've realized that we need to do something for the environment, we introduced the CSRD, this Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, with a lot of complex measuring points and a lot of work for all the companies involved. Many of these companies came back with feedback and said, well, it's going to cost us 100,000 euro to live up to this per year. We're going to lose competitiveness. And for some companies, it was even more. So the EU is scaling back. They're saying, let's try and make it more simple. But one thing they're not scaling back is the scope 3 reporting, so the supply chain reporting. You still need to do that because for many companies, not just ship owners, but for the manufacturers out there, 90% of our manufacturing companies' emissions is typically these indirect scope 3 emissions. So it is relevant for many companies out there. But I would also say, as I briefly explained before, as we start decarbonizing the vessels with the fuel, the relevance of the remaining part of the vessel will increase. And that would also prove that this is here to stay. We have perhaps slowed it down, and we should be happy. We have bought ourselves perhaps 3 more years where it's not a regulatory requirement. We do know it's coming. And then the other thing is, it's perhaps a lot less costly to start implementing something over 3 years than spending half a year buying very expensive consultants and software and try to catch up. So that's also the idea with the IMEF, is to let's start slowly now, learn from it, work together, try stuff out. Not everybody is involved in the beginning of the suppliers and the ship owners, but now we can build a framework and a foundation that we can scale up once the regulatory pressure is there.
Thank you. So you're basically verifying this is going to happen?
In my opinion, yes.
Okay. One of the things and one of the challenges we had, and I'll take 5 years back, talk about IMPA SAVE again. We weren't advertising that people should switch to Tetra Pak, but if they needed a, what you call emergency stock on board, they could. Owners could buy that, but at a double the price. But you could remove 90% of the cost of the water on board. But there was an issue that uncovered itself during that process, and that was that many suppliers actually bought Tetra Pak, had Tetra Pak available in the warehouses, but they were coming back and saying no one was buying it. They kept buying and are buying water bottles. So while we rolled out the initiative, we actually got a supply chain of Tetra Pak water across the world. And what I'm getting back to is that suppliers was telling us that we're just delivering what the owners are asking for. And we're a little bit here again with IMEF, because again we get the question, well, we're just going to give the owners what they want. So owners are waiting for suppliers, suppliers are waiting for owners, and I hear this conversation here with Paul and Dorte, but I wonder how it is with the rest. I mean, I got a ship chandler here next to me that might be able to answer some of these questions, also representing ISA. But this is the chicken and the egg situation. We're waiting for each other to get things done. You're telling me 3 years with maybe borders, but then it's a go.
Yeah, so my name is Carl Forsman. I work for a Swedish ship supplier called DFS, and I'm here today representing ISA, which I'm very happy about. ISA and IMPA working together on an issue of this importance. And regarding what you say, Mikael, is something that I recognize. Obviously, that's a fact in the industry. We keep on waiting on each other, so to speak, as you said. And I think concerning the IMEF situation, the most important thing for ship suppliers is actually to get ship suppliers, and right now I'm talking about general ship supply, so technical and provision stores, is to get people to understand why we are doing this in the first place. Because we in the IMEF Working Group, we've worked on this for years. I've joined since February, and I'm beginning to get an understanding of the technical terms and why it's important and so on and so forth. However, if you look at the industry at a whole, the knowledge about this subject is still way too, it's too low. And we need to focus, we spoke about it in the working group meeting this morning, we need to focus on educating people and getting them to understand why this is important for the ship owner in the first place. Because without the motivation for the ship supplier to understand why this is important to deliver to your customer, and why without an incentive to deliver on environmental data, you will not have an industry that is motivated to put in the work and the resources and the personnel to actually deliver what you need. So in this working group, in this context, and perhaps even in this audience with people who are interested in the subject, I think we are a couple of steps further ahead down the road, and we already understand this, but in the general industry, much more knowledge, education, spreading the gospel, if you can call it that, is still needed. Because when I speak to my colleagues within this industry, the response is very mixed, and some even some have no clue what I'm talking about in the first place, and doesn't even know about the European. And is that the ship supplier's fault? Well, perhaps to some extent, but on the other hand, it needs to come from the ship owner as well, in my opinion at least, because the ship owner needs to be very clear on what is important to them for the ship supplier to be able to provide them what they need. So it is a chicken and egg situation, but the chicken is not right and the egg is not right. It is a balance and a communication between all parties.
Thank you, Carl. And just for the people being present here, we had a meeting with 25 or 25 people this morning. I had one ship chandler who was sitting here in the third row who was mentioning that he had reached out to 33 of his suppliers, and there was only 3 responses that they were actually working on this. So that means he has 30 companies that hasn't even looked at this yet. And it also tells me that we can sit here in Europe and think we understand everything we do because it's EU regulated. But if you're outside, maybe it's not for you. But then again, it is, because if you're dealing with a European ship owner who needs this requirement, you can be based in Singapore, South Africa, Brazil. It is a requirement for you too. Otherwise, these guys, well, they will do spend-based calculations, but then you're going to have to regulate your prices because it's going to affect the emissions. So, and I want to say this much: the working group, and I'm just going to touch on it. We are close to a framework for the suppliers worldwide that can be sent out to its sub-suppliers. In this case, on the third row here. So there are documents being made and formed by the group with an agreement from owners, suppliers, even manufacturers sitting in this group. So we are trying to get as right as we can. And this information will go out sometime soon. And maybe Rasmus, you would like to comment a little bit about how the work has been done, and also you, Paolo, because even though we have a big group, we have subgroups as well. Just for people here to understand how much work is being put into this.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Yeah, I think that the work of creating this initiative have been divided in. So the first part of the work was saying, how do we actually calculate? So let's say we are calculating the emissions of a chair. How do we actually calculate this? What databases, what methods should we use? All the technical stuff. So that was the first step, was defining the calculation, aligning with industry, other industries, methodologies, and so on, so we don't invent the deep plate ourselves. So that was the first step. And the next step, that was also where you came in, Paolo, is basically saying, so how do we actually share the data? Because as a ship owner, you said, well, could be fine, we have some a good calculation, but if we can't share it between us, we don't have the procurement platforms aligned, well, then it doesn't make sense. So, Paolo, do you want to comment on that part?
Yeah, I think the digital working group was a very interesting experience because, as I said, we managed to put together the suppliers, some representative of the suppliers, to make sure we understand exactly the methodology, what they are communicating with their sub-suppliers, to make sure they understand that there is a need to modify their ERP in order to be able to store that information when that information is available. Then we brought in the procurement platforms, which are today the major channel of transferring information. Today they are transferring price, unit of measures and quantities. Tomorrow they will transfer price, units of measures, quantities, and emissions for the items for which the suppliers has an information available. And then the procurement ERPs, so the system we use to process the RFQ quotation and the order confirmation. So to make sure that these systems, which are on the receiving side, were able to receive that information and to turn that information at the end of the year in a report on the total Scope 3 emission, and also enabling the buyers to be able to evaluate not just availability, quality, and price, but also to evaluate the emissions. So to make it very clear, in the future, when the information will be available, there will be customers making a decision not just on the basis of availability, quality, price, but also adding the emission element. So if I have two quotations from two suppliers which has the same delivery time, the same level of quality, the same cost, one has lower emission than the other, we will probably go for the lower emission vendor. And there will be companies which, even if the cost from supplier A is slightly higher, but the emission of supplier A are much lower, will go with the vendor which is more expensive but has lower emission. So the paradigm is changing, because with the addition of this fourth element, there will be decision taken on all these four parameters. So the framework is allowing now to exchange the information, to make the information available at the destination, and then the consequences in the future will be also visible, because the way of selecting is gonna change, and this is also going to trigger the understanding from some vendors that they need to source better. They need to source in a more responsible way. They need to source from vendors which has the information available, which has lower emission, still maintaining the competitiveness on the price and the availability. But this is an additional dimension. This is going to influence the whole supply chain.
Thank you, Paolo. And just raise your hands here on the panel. Can we actually do this?
Yes.
By when?
By when? I don't know, Paolo, when do you have time?
I think we target in the first pilot of exchange of information by Q1 2026. So I think we have the last session of the Digital Working Group in 2 weeks from now, where some final details which were missing will be defined, and that at that point we will have a guide distributed to suppliers on what they need to have to their sub-suppliers, what they need to change in their ERPs in order to make sure that this information can be stored. And then in the same time, we will have the procurement platform and some of the procurement ERPs to modify their system in order to be able just to add these couple of fields which need to be exchanged. Once we have that, we have already identified a number of suppliers which has already collected from their manufacturer the information. So we will be able to have actually the first live transaction where a supplier storing the information in the system will be able to digital transfer this information to the procurement platform and then to the buyers into their procurement ERPs. So we will be able actually to have a transaction for which there is an order placed, and we know exactly for that particular item, that particular transaction, what is the amount of emission for the quantity. From there is just a matter of deploying it to more categories, more suppliers, more systems, and it will happen during 26. We're going to start then with 0% activity basis and 100% spend basis on day one. After 1 year, we will maybe have a 5% activity basis and 95% spend basis. We will just need to measure the ramping up and create the willingness from the industry to populate these fields. But we can also operate with spend basis. So it's just a matter of then managing the transaction. There will be probably business review with suppliers where instead of discussing about response time, failed delivery or return items, we will also discuss about the percentage of activity basis item versus spend basis items, and maybe challenge our suppliers to increase their reporting activity.
Thanks, Paolo. We have a question from the audience. Can you state your name and your question, please?
My name is Mari Pennanen, and I would like to ask about the energy consumption and how that one is taken into account. On the previous session about artificial intelligence and the future of the procurement, there was a question about the energy use. And artificial intelligence, like using ChatGPT, is using quite a lot of energy. And that one needs energy, it produces emissions and therefore increases the carbon footprint. So my question goes on that, how that is going to be included in these calculations, and whose responsibility is that? Is that on the purchaser side, on the procurement side, or on the suppliers, or the providers of these services of digital services?
So now you're mentioning AI and the emissions involved with using AI, especially electricity consumption, could also be water consumption, right? So as we stated earlier, the best possible picture we can get is to have the manufacturer to make the calculation. And how that physically works is that they have a software where they input the energy consumption and what else that they're using to manufacture their product. So they basically will need to type it in, yeah? Could be that you want to clarify?
Yeah, I want to clarify. It's not about the product, it's the service. It's the service, what, for instance, ShipServe and procurement, whatever are these digital platforms, what the procurement. So whose responsibility is that if they are using a lot of artificial intelligence to produce their service? So to whose emission it comes? Yeah. Is it then the...
Yes. Yeah, no, it's clear. And the question this morning from Michael Skafianakis was also similar, but we are making assumptions not based on data. This initiative is about making sure we have the data available in order to take the decisions. Probably the entire energy which is needed to run the entire artificial intelligence and calculation which are run by the entire maritime industry in the procurement transactions is the energy which is generated by one single vessel in an hour. But we don't know, because we're not talking about consumption in kilowatt generated by the whole activities in finding out if a screwdriver is a tool and then going into the EcoInvent database to say one screwdriver, 2.3 data. That is probably some microwatts, okay? So we need to measure before taking strategic decision. We need to be able to collect the information and understand what the actual impact of each and every service process is in order to say, well, this is a problem, this is an issue. I don't see at the moment, with the amount of energy, forget about the artificial intelligence, just the digital transactions we're doing. I mean, our server, which is running a procurement system, the supplier system, which is running the invoices in SAP, is generating a certain amount of energy and is consuming a certain amount of energy to make the transactions. Is this relevant compared to the actual energy which is used to produce the items that we're buying? What we're talking about here is, can we buy more responsibly? Can we buy systems or tools which are using less energy to be produced? Can we measure the gap between the two? And then we can measure along that also what is the energy which is used to measure this process and understand whether there is a problem or not. I I frankly don't see. I think we're talking about scale of units which are completely different in terms of quantity.
I also believe that with the IMEF standard, what the vision is, let's start with the products and move up, because we have also deliberately not chosen last mileage logistics and all the complicated things that come after producing the product. But that could also be something down the line, once we have the basic rolled out, that we all can discuss what is the next thing we need to measure. Where does it actually make sense? But I think let's get the basic building blocks in order. We do know when we have a cylinder head for a medium-sized four-stroke engine, it has the same climate footprint as producing a mid-sized car. So if you have 18 cylinders, you have 4 engines, you have 300-400 cars every 3 years. So it's also a huge environmental or climate impact that we're talking about. So it's also about, let's get the data in, and I think this initiative is a good place to start, and then we can move from there.
Thanks. There's one more question here.
My name is Jonas Erlandsen. I have a question about what measures will be in place to make sure that the suppliers are not meddling with the emission figures, underbidding other competitors, and if so, due diligence-wise, who will be responsible? Will it be the supplier, or will it be the owner, the final receiver of the goods?
There are certification standards for the data. So we have implemented into the digital transaction also that there is a digital certificate which is proving the origin of the information and the traceability. That is the idea. Of course, it's on being developed.
I also think another point to that is, if we look outside the maritime industry, we have an issue called EPD, Environmental Product Declarations. And that was an initiative that was launched some years back in order to have a third-party verified means of declaring the emissions in your product. In Scandinavia, the building industry have really made that into law. The downside of that is it costs around 20,000 euro for one company to have one product third-party verified. So we just talked about having an industry with 2,000 suppliers, millions of products. We also need to watch out we don't make it too complicated in the beginning. But it is a valid point, and we also discussed it today. So what we also discussed, setting down a working group on the verification, making sure that we align and see, are there any voluntary verification measures, just like Paolo mentioned, that we can incorporate. Because there will be suppliers that have verified data, and there will be some without. And then it will be up to the ship owner who is decoding it and making decisions to say, what is important for us? Is it the number or the verification? How do we rank it? And how do we make the decision? But for us, it's very important to make sure we have the method and the framework in order to supply the data and make it possible. But it is a balancing act. Do we want to enforce it, making it very expensive for the smaller suppliers to get involved? Or how do we want to do it? So for us right now, it's voluntary. It's in the framework that you can sign up and you can transmit verified data, but it's also possible to calculate it yourself to start off with a simple calculation.
Thanks. And Håvard?
Hello. Yeah. My name is Håvard Bue. It's probably kind of a follow-up from the previous question. You're talking about different styles of measuring, averaging, and true data. And I just have a question around that. Where do you see like spend-based, weight-based, averaging on calculation and true data? Because Paolo mentioned that if you don't have traceable figures, it's not interesting. So my question is the averaging then on the ship owners and not on the supplier? the ship chandler. So if you don't have true data, then it's up to the ship owners to do the averaging, if that's understandable.
That's exactly the matter. And this is the reason why we're saying don't panic. If you're a ship supplier, you don't need to do anything more than creating the field to populate it only when you have true data from your sub-supplier. You are a ship supplier in Sweden. You're supplying cement, which you buy from a cement manufacturer. The cement manufacturer will have calculated the emission per bag or per kilo. When you strike your purchasing contract with that supplier of cement, which is supplying to you 2,000 kilos of cement every week, you agree with them a price, and you agree with them they're going to communicate to you this information, and you just store it. Every time you're buying a full truckload of cement, you get the truckload of cement. The cost is $1 per kilo, and you're storing also the emissions communicated from the manufacturer with the certificate and certified by the Swedish authority or whatever entity in that country has certified information is stored. Whenever there is a quotation, you transfer that information without doing anything. That's true data. There is a label which says 1 kilogram of CO2 per kilo of cement. This is a certified data. This is the digital certificate. This is the true data, activity-based. You're supplying along with that a shovel and a bucket. You go to the bucket manufacturer asking for the information. They don't have it. You don't do anything. You buy the buckets, put it in the stores, emissions, blank. You pass it on. We get that information. We know the bucket is $5. We have spent 10 buckets, $50 in buckets. Buckets is still equal to tools. The tools are evaluated by EcoInvent, 2.6 kilograms of CO2 every $10. And we calculate the emission of that particular item on the spend basis, and we label it as spend-based. At the end of the year, I'm looking the data from Carl, and I'm saying Carl has been providing to me 2 items. One item with true data activity basis, one item with no data spend basis. You are producing 50% of the transaction with activity base, 50% with spend base. Carl, very good, continue like this. Please talk with the bucket manufacturer and see if now they are able to provide you true data. If you get true data, store it and pass it. If you don't get the true data, don't do anything. Just pass the transaction item. This is as simple as is for the hundreds of ship suppliers and the million of transaction line that we're doing. But you all agree with me that if you are in Sweden, the cement manufacturer from where you're purchasing the cement would probably have already or will have tomorrow true data. And the only thing you need to do is collect it, store it, and pass it on.
Yeah, and I just have to comment that that is exactly the point that needs to get across to the ship suppliers, is that we're starting from zero, and everything you can add to zero is a good thing. So ship suppliers need to, one, as I said before, realize why this is important to ship owners, and then also realize how to attack, how to handle the challenge, and that is one step at a time. If you can do it for one product, that's good enough. One finished, move to the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and it's going to take time. Anyone who's in the ship supply industry and the ship chandling industry, as myself, we know that it's not the case that data is just lying around and the ship owners are waiting for us to pick it up. The data for a lot of things is not there, but there are data for some things. So let's try to go for that first. And as we continue along this path, more and more data will be added, and more data will, in the end, be provided to the ship owners and the ship management companies. So it's a process, and the ship suppliers we can play our part just by simply understanding why we're doing it and how we're supposed to act in relations to our sub-suppliers and the manufacturers and so on. But something is always better than nothing in this regard.
And just to sum it up, this is why we started the initiative, is for alignment amongst us. And as I started out saying, it doesn't help if Paolo has one requirement for the emissions calculations, even though he can do it himself. or daughter has hers, because as a supplier, manufacturer, you just be stuck delivering different kinds of data back to them. And some of you might be thinking now, why do we even have to do this? We just do sprint-based. The fact is, we decided that the best way to move forward is to have the real data. And there's plenty of examples, and this is not a one for all, but there's plenty of examples that the sprint-based data gives a higher emission calculation, which eventually someone's going to have to pay for to run the business, the owners, or even the samplers. So we want to get to the root of everything we buy here and get the real data and the right data in to the systems. But it's a long process, and we are starting maybe from zero. Some has already started, but a lot hasn't. And that's kind of, I guess, the message both from Dorte and from you, Paolo, today, that don't panic, but let's get working on it. And that's what the group has done. We've done a framework that we will share with everyone. It's free to share with your supply chains throughout, so we can get this started. Any more questions out there? Just raise your hands.
I think we're in between people and their drinks.
Oh, sure, we sure are. Yeah, low carbon. We're at the end of the road here. I mean, come see us, come talk to us if you got questions. As I said, we will, within our group, we will provide a complete framework for you that you'll be able to use. It'll be verified at least by these two ship owners. We have a few more owners and managers on board the round table, and we'll see more coming on board. So I have nothing more to add than saying thank you for attending, and please come to us with questions and comments and ideas. We need everybody on board. Thank you.
Thank you.